I'm Jim Baxter, and this is Lecture 15, Ecological Communities for General Ecology. This is an aerial photograph of the Pantanal lagoons in southern Brazil. During the wet season, which is when this image was taken, you can see the striking green lagoons that are interspersed between patches of elevated forest. The Pantanal is one of Earth's largest wetlands. It occupies an area of up to 81,000 square miles, which makes it 10 times the size of Florida's Everglades. It's also home to about 3,500 plant species, over 650 bird species, over 300 fish species, well over 150 mammals, over 50 amphibians, and almost 100 reptiles. Mammals such as jaguars and monkeys retreat to the forest until the waters recede, feasting on fish and other aquatic wildlife trapped in shrinking ponds and pools. I show this image because it illustrates the intricate patterns that can be created on the landscape by different communities, from the terrestrial to the aquatic. Each community has a distinct assemblage of species that make it up, and which interact with one another in many different ways, through feeding relationships, mutualisms, competition, and so on, the kinds of interactions we've been talking about thus far. These intricate patterns of species and their interactions are at the heart of how communities function and the ecological benefits they provide. Today I want to introduce you to ecological communities and how we describe their structure. If you walk through a forest, hike across an alpine meadow, or swim through a coral reef, be lucky to do that, right? Need to go to Hawaii or somewhere else in the tropics. You'll notice that each contains a dizzying collection of individuals from different plant and animal and microbial species that occupy the same area and interact with one another in a variety of ways. A collection of populations of different species that occupies a given area and which interact with one another, either directly or perhaps indirectly, is called an ecological community. When ecologists study communities, they generally focus on certain functional groups of species, such as the plant community, the bird community, the soil arthropod community, or the microbial community. In practice, an ecological community is usually restricted to certain assemblages of species that share the same functional attributes, such as the specific niche they occupy. Because of this, the species making up an ecological community are usually related to one another, either taxonomically or evolutionarily. For example, the mammal granivore community, which some of you are studying this semester, looking at risks and rewards for feeding behaviors in seed-eating mammals, is defined both taxonomically, that is, they're small mammals, and functionally, that is, their feeding behavior. In other words, they all eat seeds and they use, therefore, similar resources. By studying related species with similar functional attributes, and a few of those are shown in these pictures here, this allows ecologists to control for the wide range of different factors that might affect a particular community. It also allows them, as a result, to simplify the system enough to understand what are the key processes that determine what is called community structure and dynamics. Today we'll be focusing on community structure. In the next lecture we'll talk about community dynamics. Like populations, communities have their own set of emergent properties. In our discussion of populations, we examined various emergent properties that characterize its structure and give rise to its dynamics. These include its size, density, age structure, and sex ratio, as well as birth and death rates, even intraspecific competition, which of course is competition between individuals of the same species. In ecological communities, different properties emerge that are at the level of the community only. Although communities are composed of populations of different species interacting with one another, say through competition, predation, mutualisms, ecological communities cannot be understood simply by summing all of these interactions together. Thus, emergent properties of communities are evident only at the community level and can't be predicted by studying the individual populations in isolation or summing those interactions. Perhaps the most important emergent property at the level of the community is species diversity. Since we have two labs in biodiversity and are studying this concept there, I won't cover it here in lecture. However, even though I won't cover it, I will include questions about species diversity on the final exam. Another key emergent property of ecological communities is trophic structure. The term trophic simply refers to feeding or nutrition. When applied to an ecological community, it refers to the overall feeding relationships that exist within a community. That is, who eats whom. The trophic structure of a community is usually represented graphically or through some kind of illustration that shows the trophic relationships among the different species in the community. We'll talk more about this in a moment. Ecological communities are also constantly changing over time in the abundance and composition of its species. This is called community dynamics. Although such changes can be due to seasonal variation or other short-term environmental trends, periodic natural disasters called disturbances play an important role in the life cycle of ecological communities by removing species and resetting the clock of those communities. The resulting recovery of communities to a disturbance is called ecological succession. The phenomenon of succession, which is a temporal pattern and a process of turnover of species as a consequence of disturbance or a result of disturbance, is another emergent property of the community. We'll talk more about succession in our next lecture. Because ecological communities are composed of many different species, individuals of those different species interact with one another in a variety of ways. We've learned about some of these already: competition, predation, mutualism. Yet, when describing the collective interactions in multi-species communities, ecologists define the types of interactions based on whether they're direct interactions or indirect, and whether those interactions are positive or negative. As an example, let's take a look at a simple three-species community. Illustrated on the slide are three different shapes with different colors and different letters in them. Imagine each of those different shapes a different species, labeled A, B, and C, and that they interact with one another. We might imagine that A and B are perhaps predator and prey, and therefore, of course, this would be a very direct type of interaction, and hence we refer to it as such. Again, B and C might also be directly interacting. B might be an herbivore, and C some kind of plant species, and an autotroph that it consumes, and so therefore, again, this would be a direct interaction. In a situation like this, of course, where there are three different species, one affects the other that in turn affects a third, we always have an indirect interaction that results from that. And in this case, A is indirectly affecting C through B. So this is referred to as an indirect interaction. And in multi-species communities that have many different interactions going on simultaneously, there are many different direct and indirect interactions. So like I said, if we imagine that A is a carnivore, B is an herbivore, and C is some autotroph, plant species, let's say. B could be some kind of grazer, and A may be a top predator, and C a set of different grass species, perhaps, that B, the ungulate or the grazer, eats. If this were the case, we would characterize the interaction between A and B as a negative interaction, because this is a predator-prey interaction, and of course, it's negative on B, but the way to think about it as whether or not it's positive or negative is that as A increases, B decreases. So there's a negative relationship. As one goes up, the other goes down. The same is true, of course, for B and C. As the the numbers of B go up, the number of grazers go up, the amount of abundance of grasses, say in this case, would decline, and so that would be a negative interaction. As a consequence of this, though, what would be would the indirect interaction be positive or negative between A and C? Well, in this case, because we have two negative interactions, the indirect interaction between A and C would be positive. Um, so just sort of deconstructing this, if we think about it, as A increases and B would therefore decrease, that would result in less herbivore pressure on C, and therefore C could increase because there's less herbivory on it. So an increase in A results in an increase in C, but through this multiple interactions, A and B and C being negative interactions. We'll be looking at these kinds of interactions in more complex systems in the lab coming up in a few weeks. But this sets the stage for looking at multiple simultaneous interactions in communities and how they play an important role in determining a community's structure and the dynamics of that community. Since we're going to be looking at biodiversity in the lab, as I mentioned, and we won't be covering it here, let's start with trophic structure. As I mentioned, species and communities are connected to one another through a variety of feeding or trophic relationships. This picture illustrates the trophic relationships in a simple desert food web. And by food web, I mean the network of different feeding relationships in a community. In the diagram, the arrows indicate how the species in the food web are connected to one another based on their feeding relationships. The direction of the arrow indicates who eats whom, and thus the direction of energy flow in the system. At the base of the food web is where energy enters the system. Basal species are autotrophs, and we'll refer to them this way later. In this food web, they're photosynthetic autotrophs, such as the cactus and the ocotillo shown here. Energy then moves through a set of intermediate species who are either herbivores or carnivores. The herbivores, of course, consuming those basal species, and then other intermediate carnivores consuming the herbivores, or perhaps even other carnivores. Then there are a set of top predators, in other words, at the top of this food chain or food web. In this case, it's a hawk, and the hawk is a top predator in this desert system. Let's take a look at a second food web. This one is a pelagic or an open ocean food web. You can see again that there's a whole set of basal species, intermediate species, and then in this case one top predator, the killer whale. Of course, we've been talking about the killer whale as a predator, a potential predator on sea otters, including a predator on other species as well. In this food chain, or food web, the basal species are phytoplankton. These microbial species, all of whom are autotrophs, and they're photosynthetic autotrophs. Energy is then passed up through the food chain through these sets of intermediate species, including zooplankton, and from there on up, small fish, crustaceans, birds, a set of perhaps seals and whales and things like that, all the way up to our top predator, the killer whale. You'll notice also that there are more basal species and intermediate species than top predators. This is because energy is lost as it moves from one trophic level to another. We'll talk more about this when we talk about ecosystems and productivity later. So let's look at an example. Um, this diagram illustrates the trophic food web of a freshwater fish community. Kirk Weinmiller is an ecologist who studies the feeding relations among freshwater fishes. In a 1990 paper, he described the aquatic food webs at a couple locations in the savannas, or what are called llanos, of Venezuela, and at two other sites in the lowlands of Costa Rica. His study cites supported from 20 to 88 fish species. One of Weinmiller's least species-rich sites was a medium-sized stream called Cano Volcan. This stream flows through the Piedmont of the Andes and supports upwards of 20 fish species. Still pretty diverse, but not nearly as much as some of his other sites. Weinmiller represented the food webs at his study sites in various ways and to try to understand them, through these diagrams. In some, he only included the common fish species, that is, those whose total abundance was comprised about 95% of the individuals in his collections. These common fish food webs excluded a lot of rare species. He also drew top predator food webs, that is, food webs consisting of all the prey consumed by the top predator in a community, all items consumed by the prey of the top predator, and so on down to the basal species of the food web. And lastly, Weinmiller constructed food webs that excluded the weakest trophic links, those comprising less than 1% of the diet. So all of these different ways of looking at these communities were he used to kind of give him insights into what was going on. The point here, though, is I just want to point out that these food webs, even when you have just a few species, are incredibly complex. So let's look at the results from the Cano Volcan food web. This was the simplest fish community that Weinmiller examined. And it shows that even when only 10 of the most common fish were included in the food web, it still remains remarkably complex. The most comprehensible of Weinmiller's food webs were those that focused on the strongest trophic links. In these cases, food web activities of a few keystone species were viewed to control a lot of what was going on in the communities, but again, there are many, many different interactions happening simultaneously, and all of these give rise to structure and also dynamics of ecological communities. So let's just look at some of the forces going on and a little bit, unpack a little bit more this concept of the food web. So as I mentioned, in a food web, we group species that perform similar functions into groups called, that are defined by their feeding relationships or their trophic relationships. We call these trophic levels. The trophic level of an organism is simply its position in a trophic food web, and it's characterized by its feeding role in that food web. For example, organisms at the base of the food web function as a group to capture energy that enters the food web. Once captured, this energy flows up through the food web via feeding interactions of the species that make up the food web. That is, energy flows from autotrophs through herbivores and up to carnivores. Basal species are autotrophs and can be either photosynthetic or chemosynthetic, that is, organisms that actually use chemical compounds, breaking them down to acquire energy from those. There are some interesting examples of these, like, for example, in deep sea vents, where we have organisms who are breaking down chemical compounds, and the energy released from that enters the food web and can move up through, through from those autotrophs through herbivores and carnivores up through the food chain. These organisms sometimes are also, in other words, the autotrophs are sometimes also collectively called producers because they're the source of production for all of the trophic levels above. We'll talk about producers and productivity later when we talk about ecosystems. Intermediate species consume other species, but are also consumed by predators. For example, herbivores consume autotrophs and carnivores consume herbivores or other carnivores. All, of course, are potentially consumed by a top predator. That is, the predator with a particular in a particular food web that has no natural predators itself. There are multiple levels of carnivores, but the top carnivore is referred to as the top predator. This food web that we've already looked at, this desert food web, is you know just I show it to you just to kind of overlay it on top of this new terminology, our autotrophs, herbivores, and carnivores terminology. So again, at the base of this food web, we have the autotrophs. In this case, they're photosynthetic autotrophs. Sometimes we refer to those again as producers. And energy flows up through, from those autotrophs through the herbivores to carnivores. The structure of a food web, that is, the relative proportions of autotrophs, herbivores, and carnivores, is influenced not only by the number of different trophic interactions among its species, but also cascade effects across trophic levels. Such cascade effects can alter the structure of the food web, that is, the proportion of biomass supported at the different trophic levels. This diagram shows the biomass as circles within a food web at each of 4 different trophic levels. The size of the circles depict the relative amount of biomass contained within that trophic level. At the basal trophic level is the producer. Above the producer is the primary consumer, secondary consumer, and possibly a tertiary consumer, depending upon the complexity of the food web. All things being equal, the left column shows the predicted distribution of biomass across 3 trophic levels, with producers having the greatest biomass, followed by the primary consumer, and then secondary consumer. This is a pretty typical shape, and because of its shape, it's referred to as a trophic pyramid. If there is a higher amount of production, that is, biomass being produced at the producer trophic level, then not only will the producer trophic level have greater biomass, but the biomass of all the trophic levels above it will also increase because of the energy flow moving up from the producer through the primary to the secondary and perhaps tertiary consumers. This is illustrated in the second column, where there's a greater biomass across all 3 trophic levels, and it's called bottom-up control. It occurs when the structure of the trophic food web, that is, the distribution of biomass across the trophic levels, is primarily driven by how much energy is supplied from below by the producers. So an increase in producer biomass would result in an upstream increase in biomass at the level of the primary consumer and secondary consumer, and possibly the tertiary consumer as well, if the trophic food web is that complex. In the 2 columns at the right, either a secondary or tertiary consumer is driving the structure of the food web, in terms of the biomass distribution, that is. In the 3rd column, a dominant secondary consumer, say a top predator, can, through its consumption of the primary consumer, cause a reduction in biomass of the primary consumer. This in turn causes an increase in biomass of the producer because there are fewer herbivores consuming producer biomass. This is called top-down control. In the last column is also an example of top-down control, but the cascade effect on the producer is opposite of the one in the 3rd column because of the added 4th trophic level. In this case, the top predator reduces the secondary consumer, which in turn causes an increase in the primary consumer and resulting decrease in producer biomass. These are all examples of trophic cascades. So, to make it a little more real, let's take a look at two examples. We'll start with top-down control. Approximately 60 years ago, in Yellowstone National Park, wolves were exterminated by hunting. Between 1883 and 1917, more than 100,000 wolves were killed for bounty in Montana and Wyoming alone. By the 1970s, they were listed as endangered in the United States. As natural predators of elk, the extermination of wolves in the park resulted in populations of elk building up. Without their natural predators, not only did the elk overgraze the grasslands of the park, they also overbrowsed willows, which occurred along the rivers, along these riparian corridors. This destabilized the riverbanks and caused the rivers to widen and erode. The reduction in willows also hampered beavers from reestablishing themselves in Yellowstone. Elk also overgrazed aspen and caused them to almost disappear from the park. Then in 1995, 31 wolves from Canada were reintroduced by scientists into Yellowstone National Park. With plentiful food resources in the form of elk, their population grew and caused the park's elk population to subsequent decline. Today, 20 years after the reintroduction of wolves, willows are returning along the streams and beavers as well, which build dams and create wetlands. Aspen populations are also recovering. In addition, wolf-killed elk are what you might call a smorgasbord for many different species, ranging from grizzly bears to vultures to insect-eating songbirds, etc. So, as a top predator, wolves have a strong top-down effect on biomass distribution in Yellowstone that cascades across different trophic levels. Their impacts even extend to river hydrology. By causing willows to recolonize riparian areas, wolves are indirectly helping to increase bank stabilization, as well as wetland formation by the dam-building beavers. So this is actually a tremendous example of top-down control. This graph illustrates an example of bottom-up control in the oceans. It shows the concentration of chlorophyll at various locations in the ocean in relation to zooplankton biomass in those same locations. So a simple scatter plot with a best fit line showing that as chlorophyll concentration increases and therefore as an index of producer biomass, so does zooplankton biomass. We can know this because chlorophyll is present in photosynthetic algae in the oceans, and these organisms are the primary producers in ocean systems, and therefore it can be used as an index of producer biomass. That is, the more chlorophyll, the more algae biomass. So the graph shows that as producer biomass increases, so does primary consumer biomass, and that is zooplankton biomass. This relationship indicates that as more energy enters the food web via the producers, more biomass can be supported in the next trophic level up, in this case, the zooplankton. This kind of bottom-up control is why upwelling zones, for example, like those off of the coast of California that we've talked about, are so productive. As nutrient-rich waters upwell, they provide needed and limited nutrients for producers, i.e. the phytoplankton. With more nutrients being supplied in this upwelling water, more algal biomass builds up, and hence more producer biomass can be produced. This results in more energy available to move up the food chain and support more biomass and trophic levels above. And it also tends to increase species diversity as well as simply productivity. I want to switch gears a little bit now and talk to you about two contrasting views of how ecological communities are organized. In the early 20th century, two ecologists, Frederick Clemens and Henry Allen Gleason, were engaged in a heated debate at the time about what the real nature of communities was, what the organizing framework for understanding ecological communities was. And this was such a heated debate, in fact, that Henry Allen Gleason actually left the field. So let's pick up with what these ideas were and follow this sort of their arguments along. The concepts differed between the Clemensian sort of idea and the Gleasonian idea, if I might, about how species in ecological communities are associated with one another. On the one hand, Frederick Clements argued the organismic side, and on the other, Henry Allen Gleason argued the individualistic side of this argument. And so let's just kind of walk through each of those. So the organismic concept was that ecological communities were kind of like a superorganism. That is, the community, the species within the community were very interdependent and associated with one another in very cohesive ways. On the other hand, Gleason argued that no, what associations we see in ecological communities are simply there due to chance alone. So his argument was called the individualistic model because he viewed species as sort of these individualistic entities that just simply form these chance associations, and that the communities we see today are just sort of snapshots of ever-changing populations of species responding to various factors in the environment. So very different concepts of the ecological community. On the one hand, the organismic being very interconnected, interrelated, associated, species associated with one another, kind of maintaining this cohesive whole, the organismic side, the Clemensian side. On the other, Gleason's concept of the individualistic community, where the associations of species were just simply chance associations. On the organismic side, Clements argued that communities had these very discrete boundaries, and those boundaries were there because of the tight associations of species, that if conditions changed, the species within the community would all move together as this sort of superorganism. Gleason disagreed and felt that there weren't really very discrete boundaries of communities, one community changing to another. It was that individual species tended to come and go, and that sure, there were factors that where species responded somewhat similar to certain underlying factors, but that there were no sort of marked, very sharp boundaries between communities. Clements believed in his organismic model that the species in the community were all highly co-evolved with one another, and that this was why they formed these sort of super organism-like associations with one another, and why they had such discrete boundaries as well in response to environmental conditions. Gleason argued that no, individual species experienced independent evolution, that every species was composed of populations that were evolving through natural selection in their own individualistic or independent ways. So let's explore some of the predictions of these two different concepts and some of the evidence that seems to support one or the other. The two concepts predict actually very different distributions of species on the landscape. So let's just take a look at the predictions that come out of Gleason's concept and Clements's concept. So we'll start with Clements. On the left or shown here on this slide is a graph of the abundance of uh, several species along what's called an environmental gradient. And think of an environmental gradient as just simply as you move across the land from one place to another, conditions change, right? So as you move, say, from the shore of a lake, which is very moist, um, towards the uplands, it gets drier and drier. So there's a moisture gradient there. As you move up in elevation, from, say, the Central Valley all the way up into the Sierra Nevada, quite a few environmental factors change along this elevational gradient. Gradient simply referring to the sort of the gradual change in environmental factors as you move from one place to another. It can also be a temporal gradient, over time, but for our purposes today, we'll just focus on spatial gradients. So imagine as you move across a gradient, and as conditions change, you would expect that species would come and go, that some species would become more abundant, others would become more rare, but that for species within a particular community, they would tend to, at least in Clemens's concept, move together kind of as a unit, this superorganism kind of concept. That's illustrated here in this graph, and you can see from the graph that along this environmental gradient, if we say move from left to right, you can imagine it's an environmental gradient, a moisture gradient perhaps, an elevational gradient, a gradient in some other factor, maybe in fertility or something like that. So soil parameters or so could be changing across the landscape. And if we were to measure the abundance of all of the species in the community across this gradient, we might see something like what's shown here. And what's depicted, at least on the left side of this graph, with the three different colors showing the abundance of three different species towards the left of that environmental gradient. Let's say it's a moisture gradient, and the left side is very, very wet. And so in that very wet end of that environmental gradient, we see three different species, green, depicted by green, blue, and yellow colors, that are relatively abundant and tend to co-occur with one another. But as we move from left to right along that environmental gradient, that moisture gradient, and it gets more and more dry, the graph indicates that all of a sudden we will get a shift. So as it gets drier, our blue, green, and yellow species decline and are replaced, where it gets drier on the right, with the red, purple, and black species. And that this happens fairly suddenly, and so we get a very sharp boundary along this gradient and a transition, if you will, from one community to another community. This is the Clemensian concept that predicts these sharp boundaries. So this band here would show kind of that position along which we would see a sharp transition or boundary between two different communities. And on either side, we'd see that the distributions of species would coincide with one another. Those on the left of the graph, one community, those on the right of the graph, another, with this sharp boundary in between. On the other hand, Gleason, whose concept of the community was an individualistic concept, that is, again, that, species should just have these chance associations and that they'll respond individualistically to these environmental gradients and therefore won't form discrete boundaries. If we were to graph his concept in this way along, the species abundances along some environmental gradient, and again we can imagine a moisture gradient here, as we move from left to right along this gradient, say from moist to dry, I've graphed out all 6 of the different species shown in the left graph here on the right, But now each species is sort of responding individualistically to that environmental gradient. They all kind of, come and go. They have optima where they're highly abundant, where the conditions are just right. But as you move away from those optimal conditions, they decline. Wherever you are along this environmental gradient, you'll see a community, but it'll be sort of a chance association of whatever species happen to be there. So the Gleasonian idea that species have these chance associations and that the boundaries will not be sharp and that any individual species will respond individualistically to some underlying environmental gradient would predict this kind um, of the distribution of species, and that the boundaries from one community to another would be very diffuse. They wouldn't be very sharp like the Clements idea. So just again, on the left is the organismic prediction for species boundaries or community boundaries that are sharp, and on the right, the individualistic concept would predict diffuse boundaries between communities. So let's look at some examples here for these, that support these different ideas. There are some examples actually in nature of pretty sharp or distinct boundaries between communities, and one of those is actually right here in our backyard. This picture on the left here is showing some hills near Lake Berryessa. This is just outside of the Central Valley towards the Coast Range. And you can see pretty clearly on these ridges and valleys that on the left side of the slopes, which are north facing, we see a very different type of community than on the right side of that ridge line, which is south facing. We see quite a different community, and at that ridge line is a pretty sharp boundary. This would certainly, and we've talked about this before, right? So this is an abiotic, factor on the north-facing slopes. The situation is that there's more moisture, less direct solar radiation, so we get less evaporation. Soil moisture is higher than on the south-facing slopes. So we see a pretty sharp boundary here, and this is due to an abiotic factor. Similar kinds of boundaries can be formed by other factors as well, sometimes also by soils where we have transitions between soil types, some of which can have pretty dramatic effects on the distribution of species within plant communities and can form relatively sharp boundaries. Biotic factors can also influence the transitions from one community to another. In this slide is just simply showing the potential of the effect of grazing, which is a biotic factor, of course. On the left-hand side is an area that's been grazed, and on the right-hand side, an area that is ungrazed. And of course, there's a fence line in between showing that just simply depending upon grazing pressure, you can have very different kinds of community composition, suggesting that depending upon grazing pressure, you can have relatively sharp boundaries between communities. Yet if you look at along other gradients, we see that many species also tend to show these very individualistic kinds of distributions. These graphs here are graphs of species abundances of several tree species occurring in the Great Smoky Mountains. These data were collected by Robert Whitaker in the 70s. And here is simply shown the percent of abundance within forest stands for 6 different species of trees occurring in the Great Smoky Mountains. And this is along an elevation gradient, so you can see towards the left is lower elevation, towards the right is higher elevation. And if you follow along in each of those two different panels, you'll see, let's say, if we look at the top, we'll see that at lower elevations we tend to have forests dominated by Tsuga canadensis and Liriodendron tulipifera. That's the tulip poplar and the Canada hemlock. As we go up in elevation, though, those two tree species tend to decline in abundance and become replaced by Halesia monticola. And I'm not that familiar with that species, don't know the common name, but you can see that as you get up to around 900,000 meters in elevation, that tree becomes the dominant tree. But there's really no sharp transition or sharp boundary between forests along this gradient with regard to any of these three tree species. The same is true in the bottom panel, where we see, again, transitions that are pretty gradual along this elevation gradient for three other tree species in the Great Smoky Mountains. So these kinds of data tend to support Gleason's individualistic concept. There's other types of data as well that tend to support the individualistic concept, and these are data that are based on looking at the distribution of tree species in the past. These four panels show kind of you might think of them as kind of like topographic maps, if you will. What's shown is a map of eastern North America. And for each of these four different species, the isolines there with the numbers next to them show the locations, the geographic ranges of these four different tree species going back in time to about 15,000 years ago. And so the numbers indicate thousands of years ago. And for these four different tree species, you can see that their patterns of distribution are very, very different. These data are actually based on pollen analysis of lake sediments over the past 14,000 years, and were collected by Margaret Davis. And her work here was pretty seminal because it showed pretty much without a doubt that species that we consider as part of the same community today were not always so, that they each have their own individualistic trajectories of migration over time in response to receding, the receding glaciers that, from the last glaciation. So let's just take a quick look at a couple of these. Let's start with chestnut in the lower left panel. Now these data were gathered from lake sediments, and if you pull up cores from sediment cores from lakes that have been around for the last 15,000 years, the forests around these lakes had deposited pollen year after year, decade, century after century. And those pollen can actually be analyzed and identified, in some cases to species, in other cases higher taxonomic levels. But this kind of pollen analysis of lake sediments is kind of like looking at ice cores for carbon dioxide concentration. And we've talked about this before. So the deeper you go, the older the sediments are, and those sediments and pollen grains can be dated and identified. And based on those data across a broad range of the landscape, we can actually begin to piece together the past distribution of tree species like these four in these panels here. So in the lower left is chestnut, and you can actually see that that's probably the most clear pathway of migration for chestnut. You can see that 15,000 years ago it was in the southern southwestern portion of eastern North America, and that as the glaciers, as the ice sheets, sort of receded with the warming of the climate, chestnut migrated north and east towards the northeastern United States in the direction of Maine. And so on with hickory, beech, and hemlock. Each one shows sort of its own individualistic path of migration as the ice sheets um, receded. Each of these four species is a common member of eastern deciduous forests today. However, their historical pattern of migration differs with respect to species. In other words, individual species are behaving individualistically, and the forest we see today is simply a snapshot of a constantly changing forest system in response to broad changes in climate. So, if you were to stand in an eastern forest 10,000 years ago, what would it look like? Well, it would look quite different in composition to that of the forests today, and indeed, the tree species are still responding to changes in their environment and are still migrating today. Current predictions of climate change indicate that conditions are changing faster than at any time in the past. Some species will be able to respond to these changes, but others will not. The degree to which species can respond to the rapid rate of change that we're seeing today will depend upon their ability to migrate and disperse to new locations with suitable habitat conditions. Because they're mobile, many animal species will likely be able to migrate or disperse to new locations, but for many plant species, this may not be possible. Let's take a look at some data and a question for you to determine whether it's possible for some species to disperse in keeping with the rate of change of climate conditions that are predicted over the next century. So here's the question. Are rates of tree migration fast enough to keep up with climate change? Here are a couple pieces of information to consider to help you answer this question. First of all, tree dispersal rates during the Holocene, that is about the last 10,000 years, are between 10 and 45 kilometers per 100 years. Mean global temperature is predicted to increase 3 degrees by 2100, and this is in sort of the low predicted range. Under this 2100 warming scenario, to find the same climatic conditions as today, trees would have to disperse 500 kilometers to the north or 500 meters in elevation. The question for you is this possible? Since we aren't meeting in the classroom for this lecture, go ahead and answer the question on a sheet of paper and turn it in at our next lecture.